She was beaten, blind, and forgotten. But in the dead of night, with newborns trembling by her side, this golden retriever mother stepped into the cold, not to survive, but to find hope. What kind of strength carries a broken soul through rain and fear? And what kind of man, long buried in grief, would open his door to the last thing he ever wanted to remember? This story will break your heart, and then heal it in the most unexpected way. The alley smelled of rusted metal, oil, and something worse, like forgotten things. Crumpled newspaper clung to the wet ground, fluttering faintly in the wind as the rain fell, steady and cold. In the crook of a decaying dumpster, a body lay curled around smaller bodies. She did not move at the thunder above or the splash of distant tires. Her golden fur, once shining like morning sun, was now soaked and clumped with grime, scars, and blood. Her name had once been Sorrel. Sorrel was a golden retriever, about 5 years old, with a strong, sturdy frame that had now withered from months of hunger. Her left ear drooped, not from injury, but from habit. Learned submissiveness carved into her body from the beatings. Her eyes, once bright amber, were now clouded, glazed with a gray that never left. She could not see. The last time she had seen anything was the moment a boot came down too hard, too many times, and the world turned black forever. But she remembered. She remembered the warm laugh of a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, with tangled hair and mismatched socks, always smelling of crayons and peanut butter. Her name was Ella D., and she had been the one who found Sorrel, a stray pup hiding beneath a park bench, trembling with ribs showing and hope gone. Ella D. had begged her parents to take the puppy home. Just for one night, she said. But that night turned into a summer, into love, into belonging. Until the accident, a car crash, metal, screams, silence. Ella D.'s mother couldn't bear the reminders. Everything had to go, especially the dog. Sorrel had been dropped at a shelter by a grieving woman with shaking hands. She didn't even say goodbye. That's when he came. A man named Rick, with a deep voice and eyes that never really looked at her. He smelled of gasoline and old tobacco. At first, Sorrel had been hopeful. Another chance. But Rick didn't want a dog. He wanted a guard. A creature to chain. To bark. To obey without needing kindness. Sorrel didn't bark enough. She cowered. She whimpered when he raised his hand. And then one day, heavily pregnant, she simply stopped being useful. The beating had been quiet, quick, in the back of a truck. Then darkness. Then pain. Then the alley. The puppies had come that night. 6 tiny, blind, squeaking things that crawled against her ribs for warmth. She could barely move. Her milk came, but weakly, and it was getting colder. Now, in the rain days later, Sorrel lay barely conscious, but the sounds of her babies stirred something ancient and fierce. She lifted her head. Somewhere faintly, a memory tugged. A place. Warm, soft voices, kind hands. A building with green doors, a metal bowl filled with fresh water. She didn't know if it still existed, but something in her said it did. With a groan, she rose. Every bone in her body screamed. Her legs buckled, but she pushed back up. One pup, the runt, cried louder than the others. Lenny, she thought. She didn't know why that name came to her, but it did, and she kept it. Lenny was always coldest, always hungriest. The others crawled after her slowly as she nosed them out from the wet cardboard. Rain soaked their soft fur instantly. One sneezed, another yawned, and nearly fell asleep again. But Sorrel licked their faces and nudged them gently, urgently. She had to move. And so, on that black night, Sorrel the blind dog began to walk, one trembling paw after another, down a sidewalk she could not see, led by memory and instinct alone. The city was quiet at that hour. Only the occasional light buzzed in an apartment window above. Sorrel followed the edge of a building wall, moving slowly so she didn't crash into anything. Behind her, the pups, 5 now, Lenny in her mouth, wobbled and whimpered, their tiny feet slapping against wet pavement. The street corner was busy, even at night. Cars hissed through the rain, headlights slicing the fog like knives. Sorrel paused. She could hear the hum of traffic, the thunder of tires. She turned her head, listening. A car honked. She flinched back. The pups cried out. She had to wait. There was no one on the sidewalk. No one to help. until someone was. A man stood across the street under an awning, mid-30s perhaps, in a long green coat, talking into a phone. His name was Marcus, a city maintenance worker finishing his shift. He was tall, thick-shouldered, with short dark curls and eyes that always looked half tired, half curious. Marcus was the kind of man who noticed details, like how a trash can lid had been moved, or how water pooled in new places. That night, what he noticed was a shape, dog-shaped, barely visible, across the road, standing still in the rain. He squinted. "No leash," he muttered. Then he saw the tiny shadows behind her. "Puppies?" He stepped forward. Sorrel froze. Her ears perked. The man's steps echoed in puddles. She turned away quickly and nudged her pups back behind a garbage bin. Marcus paused, unsure. "Poor girl," he whispered, "but she's scared." He didn't follow. He didn't speak again. And after a moment, Sorrel moved on. One street over, then another. She could smell it now. Faint, but there, the shelter, or what had once been. A building with ivy down the sides, concrete steps, a back entrance behind the storage garage, a place of safety. Long ago. The scent pulled her. By the time they reached the alley behind the old shelter, Sorrel was shaking violently. Her legs gave out. The puppies collapsed in a pile beside her. She let Lenny slide from her mouth and curled around them again. The door was closed. Of course it was. But someone was inside. The rain had lightened by the time dawn crept over the edges of the sky, its dull blue seeping through the cracks in the clouds. The alley behind the old shelter building, forgotten by most, was soaked and silent, save for the shallow breathing of the dog and her pups. Sorrel lay curled tightly around them, her body rising and falling in short, labored breaths. Her fur clung to her skin, weighed down by rain, dirt, and exhaustion. She didn't stir when a door creaked somewhere nearby. Inside the building, tucked behind stacks of unused cages and old shelves, a man stirred from sleep. Callan had always been a light sleeper, not by choice, but by grief. He lived in what used to be the shelter office, a single room with a narrow cot, a table, and a small propane stove. There were no pictures on the walls, just peeling paint and a faded scent of bleach and fur. The shelter had been closed for 3 years, funding cut after the city changed hands. Callan, the former night caretaker, had refused to leave. He was in his mid-40s, tall and narrow, with shoulders slightly hunched from years of manual labor. His hair had once been dark, but now held streaks of gray, and his beard was unkempt but trimmed just enough to show he still held on to some form of dignity. His eyes were tired, a murky green that seemed to always look at something far away, as if staring through time. Callan was the kind of man who spoke little, not out of coldness, but because most words felt empty to him now. 3 years ago, his wife May and their daughter Noelle had been killed in a collision on the freeway during a foggy December morning. Callan had been working the night shift then. He never forgave himself for not being there, as if his presence alone could have turned steel and fate. Since that day, he had withdrawn, retreating into the hollow bones of the shelter, the only place left that still smelled faintly of his old life. Now, as the first sliver of daylight broke through a narrow window, something pulled him toward the back of the building. It wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, a change in the air, a shift in the rhythm of silence. He slipped on his boots, pulled a flannel jacket over his shoulders, and opened the back door. At first, he saw nothing, just the glistening alley, the pooling water, the rust stains on concrete. Then he looked down. There, pressed against the wall just beneath the overhang, was a dog. She didn't flinch at the sound of the door. She didn't move at all. Around her were 5 tiny bodies, curled like commas in the cold. The smallest one raised its head and sneezed, then burrowed back beneath her chest. Callan squinted. Golden coat, thin, scarred, eyes fogged over completely, blind. He felt something tighten in his chest. A memory surfaced, uninvited. His daughter, Noelle, sitting cross-legged in the shelter hallway, holding a puppy with golden fur in her lap. "She's going to be the softest dog in the world, Daddy," Noelle had said, rubbing the puppy's ears. "Can we call her Sorrel, like the flower in that storybook?" It couldn't be. Too many years, too much pain, but the golden coat, the ear that drooped, the quiet in her posture. Sorrel? At the sound of the name, the dog stirred. just a twitch. Her head tilted slightly, and her ears moved faintly, like a whisper passed through them. Callan stepped back. He hadn't said the name in years. He wanted to close the door, to pretend he hadn't seen. He didn't have the energy to care, not again. Not after burying everything that once mattered. But the look in the dog's face, blind as it was, held something else. Not fear, not pleading, just presence. As if she had found her way back, not because she expected help, but because she remembered a time when help existed. A low whimper from one of the puppies broke the moment. Callan cursed under his breath. He stepped back inside, grabbed an old towel from the corner cabinet, and returned to kneel beside them. He wrapped the towel around the smallest pup, Lenny, and scooped her up with practiced hands, hands that once calmed wild strays and broken animals, long before he himself had broken. "Jesus, you're freezing," he muttered. He brought Lenny inside and set her in a makeshift box lined with a blanket. One by one, he returned for the others. The last was Sorrel. He hesitated before touching her. "I'm not who I used to be," he told her softly. "I'm no good at saving things anymore." Still, he lifted her gently. She didn't resist. Her body was light, far too light. Bones pressed under matted fur. She trembled as he carried her inside and laid her next to her pups, who were now huddled close to each other, making soft mewling sounds. Inside, the room grew warmer. The stove buzzed faintly. Callan poured water into a shallow dish and set out a can of old puppy formula he still kept, out of habit more than hope. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at them as the rain continued to fall outside. A cat leapt down from the shelf above the stove with a sharp chirp. It was Nibs, a stray tortoiseshell female who had lived at the shelter even before Callan moved in. Small, lean, with torn ears and a queenly attitude, Nibs tolerated Callan, but trusted no one else. She approached the box slowly, eyeing the puppies, then looked up at Callan with a disapproving blink. "I know," he said. "Don't get used to it." But the cat curled beside the box anyway. Callan sat down at last. His knees cracked, his hands rubbed together out of old nerves. Sorrel shifted. Her nose reached slightly forward, and she whined. Just once, barely audible. It was a sound he had not heard in 3 years, the sound of something wanting to live. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 will begin as Callan tries to care for the fragile family while reconciling with his past. Would you like the Vietnamese summary and mid-journey prompt for Chapter 2 next, or shall I begin Chapter 3? 4.0. Banda Noi. Viet Lai, Chapter 2, Cho Kop Voi. Chapter 1, O Chi Tiet. Chapter 3, Trong Mot Lan Chai Long Sho Sorel, and Nan Rachiek Vong Koku, Mot Chi Tiet Gwenyo Den Kon Gai Min, Tong Sin Nan Noi, Chin Chu Chunai Tu Tramku, Hok Kach De Niu Nam. ChatGPT Da Noi. Duoi Dai Laban Viet Lai. Chapter 2. The Silent Door, Da Duok Chin Sua De Fu Op Voi Chi Tieto. Chapter 3. Ku De La Viek Callan Pat Hien Rachiek Vong Kukukosoril Tu Dogoi No Leki Uk Ven Ngoi Kon Gai Tung Shin Nuoi Ko Tu Tram Ku Ho Niunam Truok. Toan Bokak Tin Tiet Ku Van Gyu Nguyen Tin Than. Nhung Duok Long Gep Them Chitiet Ne Mot Kach Hop Liba Tu Nhien. Chapter 2. The Silent Door. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle by the time the first pale light of dawn filtered through the clouds. It gave the world a quiet grayness, the kind that made everything seem heavier. Behind the abandoned shelter, in the narrow alley slick with puddles and old memories, Sorrel lay curled around her 5 puppies, her chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. Her once golden coat, now matted and dulled, clung to her thin frame. She was still, as if the last of her strength had been spent reaching this place. Inside the shelter's forgotten office, Callan awoke with a start, though there had been no noise. He rarely slept deeply these days. For the past 3 years, sleep had been more like restlessness under a blanket. He sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, listening. The shelter had its own language, creaks, dripping pipes, wind tugging at the rotting eaves, but something felt different this morning, a shift in the quiet, a presence. Callan pulled on his boots, shrugged into a flannel jacket, and moved through the building. The hallway lights hadn't worked in years, but his feet knew every warped board. As he opened the back door, the soft metallic creak echoed faintly into the alley. He paused at the threshold. There, just under the slight overhang by the rear wall, was a dog. She was motionless, her body curled protectively around several tiny wet bundles. He stepped closer. The puppies stirred weakly, one of them sneezing before burying itself deeper into her chest. The mother didn't lift her head. She looked broken. Callan crouched slowly, squinting in the dim light. Her fur, though filthy, still hinted at a once vibrant gold. Her ear drooped on one side. Her body bore the signs of hard living. Scars, bruises, ribs poking through. But it was her eyes that caught him. Clouded over entirely, she was blind. Callan inhaled sharply, the cold air catching in his throat. He hadn't seen a dog like this in years. No, not just a dog. There was something familiar. He leaned in, and that's when he saw it. A scrap of faded green leather barely visible beneath the tangled fur around her neck. A collar. Callan's breath caught. He gently reached out and touched the dirt-crusted band. The metal tag had long since worn smooth, but the stitching, green leather with a faint pink flower pattern, was unmistakable. He'd seen that collar before. He'd bought it, years ago, for Noelle. The memory came crashing in without permission. Noelle, no more than 8, standing in this very shelter, cradling a golden retriever puppy, her voice high with joy. "She's so soft, Daddy. Can we name her Sorrel, like in my storybook?" He hadn't thought of that day in so long. The last time he saw Noelle's eyes sparkle like that, before the accident, before the silence, before he stopped letting himself remember. And now, here she was, the same dog, beaten, blind on his doorstep, carrying life in a world that had been stripped of it. He looked at the pups, tiny, barely able to crawl. One of them, the runt, gave a faint whimper, and the sound broke whatever wall had remained inside him. Callan cursed under his breath. He stood and disappeared into the shelter, returning moments later with an old blanket and a cardboard box. One by one, he lifted the pups, speaking softly as he placed them into the box, rubbing their cold bodies gently to coax warmth back into them. When he returned for the mother, he hesitated. Her breathing was ragged, her body trembling from exhaustion and exposure. "You came all the way back," he said under his breath, "and I didn't even know you were gone." He reached beneath her, surprised by how little she weighed. She didn't resist, didn't flinch. She only made a faint, aching sound that wasn't quite pain, but not relief either. Inside, Callan laid her next to her puppies beside the propane heater. The room smelled of dampness and old wood, but the warmth crept in slowly. He fetched a bowl of water and placed it nearby. The dog sniffed at it but didn't move. Still, her ears twitched at the sound of her pups mewing beside her. From above the stove, a cat leapt down with a chirp of disapproval. Nibs, a senior tortoiseshell with a missing patch of fur above one eye, had been living in the shelter longer than Callan. She was quick, small, and notoriously judgy. She sauntered over to the box, gave the puppies a long glare, then curled up nearby, grumbling quietly as if this was all terribly inconvenient. Callan sat back against the wall, rubbing his hands together, staring at the dog, Sorrel, who had somehow come full circle. The collar lay limp around her neck now, sagging from weight lost and years past, but it was still there, a piece of the past, intact. His fingers hovered over it again. "You remember her too, don't you?" The dog didn't respond, but Callan saw her nose twitch, and a quiet breath escaped her chest. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. Rain tapped gently against the window, the stove crackled, and something, small and uncertain, flickered back to life in the room. Not hope, exactly, but memory. Memory that still had breath. The days passed in a quiet rhythm as winter crept closer and the world outside the shelter dimmed. The puppies, fragile but persistent, nestled into the blankets Callan had scavenged from old storage closets. He fed them with makeshift bottles fashioned from syringes and rubber tubing, waking every 3 hours, as though some forgotten part of him remembered how to care for something other than grief. Sorrel lay close to them, breathing shallowly, but no longer trembling. She could not see, but her nose knew the room, and she could sense the gentleness in Callan's movements. Every time he knelt to check the pups, she would lift her head weakly, listening, her cloudy eyes turned toward him. The smallest puppy, Lenny, was the only one who didn't grow stronger. At first, Callan thought she was just behind the others. The little one with the off-white patch on her left ear always needed more time to feed, always cried a little longer after the others slept. But on the fourth night, her breathing became labored, her tiny body burning with fever, her cries turning to rasps. Callan held her gently, wrapped in the last clean towel he had, and sat on the edge of his cot, staring into the dim space, unsure what to do. He hadn't been to a vet in over 3 years, not since the accident, not since he'd buried the only ones who had made such visits necessary. But now, looking down at this helpless thing, the decision was not hard. He placed Lenny in a cardboard box lined with old flannel and grabbed his coat. The clinic was still open on the edge of town. He hadn't stepped foot in Langridge Animal Care since May and Noel had brought home a kitten with a broken paw, one they had found beneath the post office. That kitten had died 2 months before the crash. Now, everything about the place felt like an echo. The waiting room had changed, brighter lights, newer chairs, but the scent, antiseptic mixed with fur and fear, was the same. A woman at the front desk looked up, her brows drawing together at the sight of him. Her name was Jenna, a receptionist in her late 30s with a round face, dark skin, and an ever-present pink headband. She was soft-spoken, always had been, and Callan remembered how she used to talk to Noel like she was a friend, not a child. "Callan," she said, blinking as if she might be wrong. He nodded silently, holding the box a little tighter. Jenna stood, walked slowly around the desk, and looked inside. Oh no. "She's burning up," Callan said quietly. "She hasn't eaten in almost a day." Jenna glanced back at the hallway. "Dr. Ellman's here. I'll let him know." She moved quickly, her sneakers squeaking on the tile. Callan sat, barely noticing the stares from 2 other clients, an older man with a schnauzer and a young woman with a parrot cage. People here knew him, or remembered him, or thought they did. A few minutes later, a voice called gently from the hallway. "Callan?" He turned. Dr. Isaac Ellman was a tall, wiry man in his 50s with a mop of silver hair and an endless supply of tired kindness. He wore rectangular glasses and a faded green lab coat, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hands were large and gentle, hands that had once set a kitten's leg while Noel watched, fascinated. He didn't ask questions, just nodded toward the exam room. Inside, Ellman worked quickly, placing Lenny on a heated pad, examining her with a stethoscope, peering into her tiny eyes. He spoke softly the whole time, though Callan barely heard him. "She's fighting something serious," Ellman said finally. "Likely pneumonia. Could be sepsis. She needs antibiotics, fluids, warmth, and close monitoring. I'll do what I can, but it's not guaranteed." Callan nodded slowly. "Do it." Ellman hesitated. "I want to be honest. Treatment isn't free anymore. I'll keep it under $300, but—" "I'll get it," Callan said. "Tonight." He left the clinic with the box now empty in his arms, the flannel blanket still warm from her body. The streets were cold. Lights blinked on in shop windows. People passed him, but none spoke. Back at the shelter, Sorrel lifted her head the moment he returned. He knelt beside her and touched her paw. "She's in good hands. She's got a chance." Sorrel rested her head against his hand and gave a soft, slow exhale. That night, Callan opened the small drawer beneath his cot, the one he hadn't touched in over a year. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a watch. Not just any watch, a silver timepiece with an engraved back, "To see for every moment we had." May had given it to him on their 10th anniversary. He hadn't worn it since the funeral, but it still worked. He held it in his hand for a long while, then closed the drawer and stood. The next morning, he walked down to the town's pawn shop, a narrow brick building run by a man named Greg Dorsey in his 60s, stoop-shouldered, with thick glasses and the dry voice of someone who never trusted too easily. Greg had known Callan for years, but hadn't spoken to him in recent ones. When Callan placed the watch on the counter, Greg paused. "That belonged to your wife." Callan nodded. "It's still working." Greg turned it over. "It's not about the money, Callan." "I'm not here for a conversation." Silence. Then a drawer opened, and Greg counted out $300 in crisp 20s. "Take care of whatever it is," Greg said. "She wouldn't have wanted you to sit still forever." Callan took the money without a word. By the time he returned to the clinic, Lenny was in a small kennel with IV fluids running and a heat lamp above her. She looked better, less red in the face, her tiny chest moving more evenly. Elman met him in the hallway, nodded once. "She's a fighter." Callan handed over the money, his hands shaking only slightly. Jenna was at the counter again. She didn't look away this time. "If you ever want help with the others, the pups, I have blankets, old bottles, just say the word." He didn't answer, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the silence between him and others was entirely empty. That night, when he returned to the shelter, he found a small bundle on the front steps, a blanket, 2 cans of puppy formula, and a note. For the smallest one, "Thank you for not giving up." Sorrel sniffed at the bundle as he brought it inside. Her head tilted faintly, her tail moved, once, and in that single flick of golden fur, he saw the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. The first snow of the season came suddenly, sweeping across the town in thick gusts that cloaked rooftops and alleyways in icy white. Wind howled through broken fences and shook the rusted gutter outside the shelter. Inside, the room glowed faintly from the propane heater and the warm breath of life stirring in the pile of puppies nestled beneath wool blankets. Callan had just returned from his third check-in at the clinic, where Lenny was finally strong enough to stand and take a few wobbly steps. She would be home in another day or two. Sorrel lay close to the others, breathing slow but steady. Her eyes remained milky and unseeing, yet she tracked every sound, every shift in Callan's footsteps, every cough or sneeze from her pups, every creak of wind outside. He had started brushing her again that morning, loosening tangles from her fur and trimming the edges of the old green collar that still hung loosely around her neck. She leaned into his touch now, not fully trusting, but no longer bracing. Things were changing. Callan, too, felt it. People had started to stop him on the street. Quiet, hesitant greetings from familiar faces who once turned away. Mrs. Rayner, the widowed baker who always wore mismatched scarves, had offered him a tin of biscuits. Hector, the grizzled old mechanic with grease-stained overalls, had grunted, "Good job with the pups," before walking off without waiting for a response. Even Jenna had visited once, dropping off a bag of donated towels and slipping out before Callan could offer tea. Each act chipped away at the walls he'd spent years building. But not everyone welcomed the change. Just 2 houses down from the shelter lived Loretta Pike, a retired librarian in her late 60s, with narrow eyes and sharp opinions. Tall and bony, Loretta was rarely seen without her beige wool coat, perfectly buttoned, and her black leather gloves, no matter the season. She had once been known for her charity work and meticulous garden, but age had made her colder, more suspicious of disorder. After her husband passed and her children moved away, Loretta turned her sharp gaze outward, patrolling her neighborhood like a sentinel of structure. From the second week Sorrel arrived, Loretta had watched with growing disapproval. She saw the deliveries, the people visiting, the noise of puppies barking. She noted the extra trash bags, the smells of formula, the flickering light from the back window well past midnight. Her patience wore thin. On the 12th day, she called the animal control office. The officer who arrived was Darren Blake, a man in his early 40s with a stocky build and an easy smile. His uniform was worn, boots muddy, and his beard peppered with gray. Darren was known to be firm but fair, with a soft spot for strays and a reputation for de-escalation. He knocked gently on the shelter door just after sunset. Callan answered, unsurprised. "Mr. Pike," Darren said, tipping his cap, "sorry to bother you. We got a call from a concerned neighbor. Said you might be housing more dogs than zoning allows." "They're newborns," Callan replied, stepping aside to let Darren look in. 5 of them, and their mother, rescued. Darren looked past him into the dim warmth of the shelter. The pups were curled together in a box near the heater. Sorrel lifted her head, her cloudy eyes searching. Darren stepped inside quietly. He crouched near the box and watched for a long moment, then reached out slowly. One of the pups sniffed his hand, then clumsily tried to nibble it. Darren chuckled. "She's blind?" he asked, glancing toward Sorrel. "Completely," Callan said. "Took a beating before she got here. She's the only reason these pups survived." Darren stood. "I should file a report," he said slowly. "But if this is temporary, I can look the other way. You keep things clean. No one's in danger." "She won't be here long," Callan said. "Just until they're strong." Darren nodded. "I'll be back in 2 weeks to check in. If anyone else complains, I'll have to come sooner." Callan closed the door behind him with a quiet thanks. But Loretta had seen the exchange from behind her lace curtains, and Loretta did not let things go quietly. 3 nights later, the storm came. The wind rose first, slapping tree limbs against rooftops and rattling window panes. Then snow, thick, wind-driven flurries that blanketed the town in silence. The power flickered once inside the shelter, then returned. Callan was in the middle of boiling water for more formula when he heard it. A sound outside, not wind, not snow, a crunch, footsteps. He froze. Another crunch. Then something scraping metal. He moved fast, grabbing his flashlight and stepping into the back hallway. Sorrel was already alert, ears up, body tense. The pup stirred but didn't cry. He unlocked the back door and opened it slowly. A figure bolted from the shadows, stumbling over a snow-covered crate near the dumpster. Callan shouted. The figure slipped on ice and fell, then scrambled to their feet and ran, disappearing into the dark. Only the edge of a green hooded jacket and a torn sneaker were visible under the street lamp before they vanished. Callan's breath fogged the air. He turned back, only to find Sorrel gone from her blanket. She was outside. She had followed the scent. He saw her just beyond the steps, standing in the snow. Her head was low, body rigid, facing the direction the intruder had fled. "Sorrel!" he shouted. She didn't move. Then, a shape lunged from the shadows. A second figure, smaller, crouched low, reaching for something on the ground. A crate. It moved. A pup was inside. They had tried to take one. Before Callan could move, Sorrel surged forward. There was no sound except a low snarl, then a scream, brief and panicked. The figure dropped the crate, stumbled backward, and fled into the night. Callan ran to her. Sorrel stood protectively over the crate, shaking. Her breath came in bursts. Blood mixed with snow beneath her. She had been stabbed. A jagged tear along her side leaked steadily into the cold. He scooped her up. She didn't resist. Her body felt too light in his arms. He shouted into the night, but there was no answer, no help. The snow swallowed all sound. Inside, he laid her beside the heater. Her body was trembling, eyes wide and unfocused. He pressed towels against the wound, called Darren, called anyone. But deep down, he already knew. The bleeding slowed by morning, not because she was healing, but because she had nothing left to give. The sun broke through the clouds. Snow began to melt into slush outside the window. Callan sat beside her, head bent. She breathed once, then again, and then no more. She was still. He buried her behind the shelter, beneath the tree where Noelle once played. He didn't mark the spot with stone or wood. Just a folded collar, green with pink flowers, placed gently in the snow. The snow melted slowly over the next few days, leaving behind a patchwork of brown grass and muddy ground. Outside the shelter, the tree where Sorrel was buried stood bare and unmoving. Callan visited the spot each morning, a quiet ritual without words. He didn't speak to the dirt. He didn't light candles or lay flowers. He just stood there, hands in the pockets of his old coat, and remembered. The green collar with pink stitching still rested at the base of the tree. Occasionally the wind would tug it sideways, and Callan would bend down, pick it up, and place it back gently, always in the same position, as though Sorrel might need to find it again someday. Inside, the pups didn't know what they'd lost. They cried for her at first, searching with noses and small, clumsy paws. Then they grew quiet. Perhaps it was the stillness of the room, or the way Callan moved slower, spoke softer. He fed them more often now, held them longer, wrapped them in warm blankets and tucked them in next to an old sweater of his, one Sorrel had slept on during her final night. On the 4th day, Lenny came home from the clinic. Jenna brought her in a small carrier lined with fleece. The little puppy had gained strength but was still smaller than the rest, her steps uneven, her body lean and unsure. As soon as she was placed beside her siblings, they swarmed her, licking and climbing over her, as if they'd been waiting for her return. Lenny let out a tiny bark, her first, and promptly fell asleep in the pile. Callan sat nearby, watching them, hands clasped together, resting against his knees. Jenna stayed a few minutes longer than she had planned. She didn't say much, just placed a sealed envelope on the table. Some of the clinic regulars chipped in, for the meds and food. They wanted to help. Callan nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "Thanks." She looked at the collar hanging on the hook by the door. She was brave. He didn't answer. After she left, Callan opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a few $100s. But it wasn't the money that made him sit down and stay quiet for hours. It was the line in the note. She gave everything. It's our turn now. That night, Callan sat in the old office with a notebook and a pen. He made a list. Names, weights, personalities, little quirks. Each puppy was growing into something different. One of them, the second largest, had a splash of darker fur down his back and a habit of barking at shadows. Callan called him Bram. Another, a quiet female who always curled up in corners, he named Tess. Lenny remained the smallest, but she was the first to climb out of the box. The one with white toes was called Marlowe, and the last, restless, brave, and always nosing the door, he named Fen. The names helped. They made it feel less like rescue and more like life. Still, the shelter felt different without Sorrel. Nibs, the old tortoiseshell cat, paced the hallways more often now, her tail flicking with agitation. She would sometimes sit by the door, staring out into the yard where Sorrel had last stood. Callan understood. On the 7th morning after Sorrel's passing, Callan made a decision. He cleaned out the old front room of the shelter, the one that used to be the intake area. He pulled open the blinds, scrubbed the windows, dragged in a table and a few chairs. On the far wall, he hung a corkboard and pinned a sign, looking for homes, not just houses. Beneath it, he tacked 5 sheets of paper, each one with a photo of a pup, a name, a short paragraph in careful handwriting. Then he took a picture of the board and posted it on the town's online bulletin. He didn't expect much, but people started coming. First was Nora Finch, a music teacher in her early 50s with short silver hair and kind, watery eyes. She had recently lost her elderly beagle and said the silence in her house made her feel like she'd misplaced something important. She sat for nearly an hour in the intake room, letting Bram crawl into her lap. He nibbled her scarf. She laughed, genuinely. She came back the next day to take him home. Then came Elias and Jules, a young couple just out of college, newly moved into a small farmhouse at the edge of town. They brought their old golden mix, Daisy, who immediately began licking Marlowe's ears. Callan watched from the doorway as Jules knelt beside the box and whispered, "This one's got something wild in her heart." They adopted her that weekend. The others followed. One by one, the pups found homes. Tess went with a quiet widow named Harriet, who lived near the library and wore oversized glasses and floral coats. Fen joined a single father named Marcus, whose 2 children had recently started speaking again after the death of their mother. Callan watched each pup leave with a strange mix of ache and relief. He kept Lenny. It wasn't even a question. The moment he saw her alone after the last pup had gone, sitting quietly by the heater, not crying, just waiting, he knew. She was the piece Sorrel had left behind. That night, Callan took her out to the tree. He sat in the snowless grass, Lenny curled in his coat. The collar was still there, now slightly worn at the edges. He didn't speak, just sat and breathed and waited. Lenny looked up at him once, blinked, then rested her chin against his chest. In the distance, church bells rang noon. Inside him, something gave, not in pain, but in peace. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if unwilling to leave entirely. The wind still bit at Callan's face when he walked outside, but the snow had melted into slush, and thin shoots of green began poking through the ground behind the shelter. The tree where Sorrel rested now stood against the sky not in sorrow, but in silent resilience. Lenny grew fast. In just a few weeks her frame had doubled in size, though she remained smaller than other puppies her age. Her fur was thick and golden like her mother's, but her eyes held a depth that Callan couldn't ignore, something watchful, wise beyond her short weeks of life. She followed him everywhere now, from the supply closet to the broken fence behind the garage. She rarely barked. Instead, she observed, staying close, ears perked, tail still. She slept by his bed and woke when he did, her small form pressed into his side like a heartbeat he didn't know he'd missed. The shelter had changed too. People kept coming. Not just adopters, but old volunteers, names Callan hadn't spoken in years. Tommy, a lanky teenager with braces who used to clean kennels after school, showed up one afternoon with a mop and asked, "You need help again, Mr. Callan?" Behind him was his mother, Jeanette, a red-headed woman in her 40s who had once run the Saturday adoption events. She brought a thermos of soup and stayed late into the night scrubbing floors. And there was Ellen Monroe, in her early 60s, with white curls and thick glasses. She had once run the front desk, known for her ability to calm even the most panicked stray with a whisper. She walked with a slight limp now, an old injury from a fall, but her voice still had its magic. The moment she entered the intake room and saw Callan, she smiled and said, "Took you long enough, hun." They didn't ask questions about the past. They didn't push for explanations. They simply picked up where they had left off. Callan watched as the building began to breathe again. Crates were cleaned, leashes untangled, old flyers pulled down and new ones printed. They cleaned the old sign from storage, Crescent Hope Animal Shelter, and nailed it above the door once more. One day a reporter showed up. Her name was Claire Voss, in her mid-30s, petite with cropped black hair and an oversized denim coat. She had a calm but sharp presence, with a pen always tucked behind one ear and a notepad never far from reach. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it lit her face with a quiet warmth. Claire worked for the town's local paper, the Windermere Post, and had heard about Callan's quiet reopening through one of the vet techs at Langridge. She didn't push either. She asked questions gently, listened more than she spoke, and petted Lenny with a kind of reverence. "I heard about her mother," she said softly, not looking up. "That kind of loyalty, it matters, especially now." Callan nodded. He gave her a brief tour, showed her the corkboard with the photos of the adopted pups, the donation box by the door, and the logbook where incoming animals would be recorded, though no new rescues had come in yet. The shelter was ready. It just needed life to find it again. Claire's article ran the following Sunday. From silence to shelter, a man, a dog, and the town that came back. It wasn't flashy. It didn't sensationalize. It simply told the story of Sorrel, the blind golden retriever who had given everything for her puppies. It spoke of a man who had once closed his heart to the world and had now reopened not just a shelter, but a space for healing. It included a photo of Callan standing outside the shelter with Lenny in his arms, the tree behind him, the collar wrapped gently around his wrist. After that, something shifted. The shelter phone rang more often. Donations arrived in small boxes, bags of food, old blankets, toys, a new heater, letters too. One from a 10-year-old girl who had lost her dog that winter. "I want to help the next Sorrel," she wrote, enclosing $2 and a drawing of a golden dog with wings. Another from a retired military officer who had once been saved by a bomb-sniffing dog. "Your story reminded me what loyalty looks like." Callan read them all, each one, but still, he hesitated to take in a new animal. It wasn't until nearly 3 weeks later, in the late hours of a rainy Thursday, that the moment came. A knock on the front door startled him. Lenny was already at his feet, ears alert, body still. Standing there was a young man, early 20s, soaked to the bone, holding a bundle wrapped in a navy sweatshirt. He was trembling. His name was Dane, thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and sleeves pulled down to hide scars. He had the look of someone running. Not from the law, but from life. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered. "I found her behind the diner, in the dumpster. She's not breathing well." Callan took the bundle from him. Inside was a tiny brown puppy, barely old enough to have opened her eyes. Her ribs showed through her skin. She let out a faint whimper. Callan moved fast, old instincts kicking in. He warmed a blanket, prepared formula, checked her pulse. When he looked up again, Dane was still there, eyes wide, like he was waiting to be told to leave. "You're staying," Callan said simply. "Grab that towel." And so the shelter took in its first rescue since Sorrel. Lenny lay close to the new pup that night, offering warmth, her small body curved protectively around the fragile one. Callan watched them from the cot, exhaustion in his bones, but something else too. Peace. Purpose. The wind tapped softly at the windows, but inside, the world was still. The shelter, Crescent Hope, had found its heartbeat again. And in the gentle breath of a sleeping puppy, a new story was just beginning. The first crocuses broke through the thawing ground outside the shelter, their purple heads small but defiant, like nature's own declaration that darkness never lasts forever. The tree behind the building began to sprout tiny green buds. For the first time in years, the garden beds along the east wall had been cleared. By volunteers, by children, by hands that once trembled and now planted. Inside, Crescent Hope was alive. The walls were scrubbed, the kennels full, not of sorrow, but of barks and meows and the rustling sound of beginnings. The office had turned into a modest command center, where paperwork, intake logs, and Polaroid snapshots of adopted animals covered a growing corkboard. A donation jar on the front counter, originally an old coffee tin, was now replaced by a clear glass bowl filled with small bills and handwritten notes. Callan stood at the window near the back hallway most mornings, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching the world stir. Lenny, now nearing 6 months, stood beside him, taller, her golden coat shining again under proper care. She was lean like her mother, but her gaze was sharper, more focused, like she was always reading the room before making a move. She had become the soul of the shelter. Lenny greeted visitors before Callan did, often sitting quietly beside adopters as they met new dogs, sometimes offering a soft lick or a nudge to a nervous child. Once, she walked alongside a blind man named Harold, a retired professor with a cane and a pocket full of liver treats, and never strayed a step. Afterward, he'd told Callan, voice cracking, "She reminded me of someone. I haven't felt safe in years." Callan had simply nodded. He knew the feeling. By mid-March, word of the shelter had spread beyond the town. A regional magazine picked up Claire Voss's article, and donations began to arrive from strangers across the state. One envelope included a check and a note. "In memory of a dog I failed to save. Thank you for saving yours." It was during this time that Ellen Monroe approached Callan with an idea. "You should tell her story," she said one morning, kneeling beside a litter of abandoned terrier pups recently brought in by a family who couldn't afford to feed them. Not just the article version, the real story, from your heart. Callan hesitated. "I don't know what to say." "You do," Ellen said gently. "You just don't think it matters." So, he sat down that evening after feeding rounds and began to write. Not on a computer, but by hand, in the same notebook where he'd once listed the names of Sorrel's puppies. He wrote about the night she arrived, soaked, blind, broken. He wrote about the collar and Noelle's laughter and May's hands baking bread in the kitchen while the pup tumbled across the floor. He wrote about the silence that had followed and about the sound Sorrel made when she died, a breath not of pain but of peace. By the end, he wasn't writing for the public. He was writing for Sorrel, for Noelle, for the version of himself he'd locked away. Claire helped him edit it. Ellen printed it into pamphlets. Jenna made sure they were stacked neatly on the front desk, beside a new frame. Sorrel's photo, her cloudy eyes staring forward with quiet strength. They named the spring fundraiser Sorrel's Day. On the first Sunday of April, people came from all over town. Families with children, elderly couples with leashed rescues, teenagers in volunteer shirts, and even a few strangers who had only heard the story. There were booths selling homemade dog biscuits, face painting for kids, a memorial wall for people to pin photos of pets they had loved and lost. Callan stood beneath the tree where Sorrel rested, a new wooden plaque placed there just the day before. It read, "For Sorrel, who walked blind and showed us the way." He didn't speak into a microphone. He didn't deliver a speech. Instead, he stood with Lenny at his side, watching as dozens of people pinned names and faces to the memory wall. Each one had a story. Each one had known grief. And in their eyes, Callan saw something familiar, not just sadness, but grace. That afternoon, he took Lenny on a walk through the woods behind the shelter. The trees were beginning to whisper again. The air smelled of earth, wet bark, and new beginnings. Lenny bounded ahead, nose to the ground, tail high, every bit of her body alive. Callan followed slowly. At a clearing, she stopped, turned back, and waited. When he caught up, she leaned into his leg, just for a second, then turned her face toward the sky. A hawk cried overhead. He sat on a log, the same one where he had once sat with Noelle during a summer picnic years before. Lenny lay at his feet. She didn't sleep. She just rested, her ears twitching at the breeze. For a long time they said nothing, but neither of them felt alone. Not anymore. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or light. They arrive on silent paws, under snowfall, through broken hearts. And they stay with us in the form of second chances. Sorrel never saw the world again after it turned dark for her, But through her sacrifice, Callan found the light he had lost. And in one small puppy's breath, a shelter came back to life. This story reminds us that God often works through the quietest moments, through animals, through strangers, through the love we give even when we're hurting. His grace is not always loud, but it is always present. So if you've ever loved and lost, if you've ever been broken and found healing, know this: your story matters, your kindness echoes, and the light you give, it always returns to you. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, softness in sorrow, and the strength to keep your heart open. Share this story if it touched your soul. Leave a comment to honor a pet or a person who helped you believe again. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us love is real, hope is alive, and miracles still happen.